time around the Council, right? And so this was 325 was the Council of Nicaea. Athanasius was he was the bishop in Alexandria for a very long time. He apparently, as the story goes, he went from being a deacon to being a bishop, and that made a lot of people quite upset because he was also like maybe 29, 30 at the time. It would be like me being a bishop, which is a bad move right now. And he is a fascinating character. He was exiled 5 times during his time as a bishop for different stances against the Arian controversy, which is basically the entire thing that was debated. Well, one of the things that was debated at Nicaea, this idea that God or that Jesus wasn't really God, or he was God in a different way, but not in the same way. And so, what we get in Saint Athanasius is this very, very, very big defense of Nicene Christianity, right? And so this idea that he is constantly hammering home over and over and over again that Christ is God, that Jesus is God in the same way, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, right? He helped write, or he at least helped expound that Nicene kind of definition in the creed right there. Does that make sense? Okay, and so before we get started on some of the other stuff, what do you guys have any of you started reading it? I know you have. Have you guys started reading it? That's okay. I did not expect anyone to have read it. Yeah, don't worry. Um, but I like one of the things in this specific copy. C.S. Lewis wrote the introduction, and he's this famous Anglican, right? But he talks about why we should read old books, right? Why we're not, one of the reasons that we picked this book, good question, was there are lots of things that have been written in recent eras. Like there's a really great book called Christ the Key by Catherine Tanner that was written, I don't know, 5 years ago. That is kind of she uses a ton of Athanasius's stuff. But one of the reasons we wanted to pick this is because this is so foundational. And he was such an architect of something that we say every Sunday and we put our faith in every Sunday with the Nicene Creed, right? And so to understand kind of at base level where we are, something that St. Athanasius, this guy who is like very, 1700 years ago, um, how what he says actually still like matters today. And how we have developed some of our incarnational theology starting here. He was one of the first to kind of expound it in this big way. There were others before him for sure, but to kind of lay it out in this way. And plus, one of the fascinating things about him, this is written in a shockingly, like, it's dense. There's no getting around it. It is a dense text, but it's not impenetrable, not even a little. He does such a good job, even in the Greek. I have a Greek version at home that I translated a little bit of when I was in seminary, and it was shocking to me how easy it was to translate. It's still Greek, but it was shocking to me how like easy it was to look at this and be like, okay, he's going at this deep, deep mystery, but he's doing it in a way that we can understand. And so that translates really quite well to English and in the modern day. Boss, you want to add anything?
Yeah, one of the reasons we picked this, right, the foundational text, but also looking at a church father, which Athanasius is, church father, and there's church mothers, but these are folks who like, doctors of the church they set the course for all theology that's followed, right? Like, um, and so this gives us a chance to look at what the early folks who are a couple generations removed from this whole operation, what they started to develop,
Mm-hmm.
as far as why God became flesh,
Yeah.
what it means that God became a human, and all of that. And we have other areas where we read more common books, not more common, that's the wrong word, but more modern books and more modern ideas. But we wanted to take a crack at this one.
Yeah. And especially because it's Advent, right? Advent is all about the incarnation. It's all about like God becoming person, God becoming human, God coming into the world, God becoming one of us, God coming to us, being with us, being present with us. And so taking this foundational text on that idea during the Advent season and doing, it's a little book, like half of this book is the introduction, right? And like this is the text. And so just taking that for the next couple weeks, working through it as best we can. And I think that that'll be what we do. So so we've talked a little bit about um, Athanasius's life. He's a fascinating character. He was, exiled 5 times because of some of his theological positions that ran afoul of the Roman emperors of the day. But one of the things that gave him was time in the desert, right? And so he kind of puts together this really amazing. So he was raised probably quite wealthy, had a great education. It's one of the reasons he's able to use language in this way that is so high level and so accessible at the same time. So he had this great education, probably came from a wealthy family, but he spent so much of his life wandering the desert with the ascetics because even while he was a bishop, he was exiled. And so he has this kind of notion of monasticism that seeps through, which is fascinating because at that time, right? Um, at that time, monasticism was the mark of true Christianity, right? So we were kind of coming from the point of the first couple centuries of Christianity. Martyrdom was the true marker of Christianity. If you were martyred, you were faithful. You were for real, if you got killed for the faith. But then we come into this time of Constantine, of it becoming the state religion of Rome, and all of these things. And so actually all of Athanasius's work in the church as a bishop was during the time when there was really no more martyrdom. There was like pockets of it here and there when you really ran afoul, but because it was the state religion of Rome, there was really no more martyrdom on a large scale. There was not a whole lot of persecution. And so there became the thought, all right, how do we like who are our real Christians? Who are our faithful ones? And so it became monastics. It became people who were wandering the desert. It became people who would sometimes sit on poles 20 feet in the air and just meditate all day long. The stylites, they're fascinating. But so he spent so much time with them, and that's where we get the desert fathers and mothers, right? These are the people who were wandering the desert, and he became one of them as well. So he brings this rich tradition of early monasticism into the conversation as well. One of the things I'm trying to think what what we need to talk about before we get into the
What you were
text.
saying about Constantine and all that, that's when theology could really develop because these folks were no longer running for their lives.
Yes.
So they could sit around and think about these things.
Yes.
So much of it before, it's like, we need to tell people about this. And also, we're at risk.
Yeah.
But here with this era, we start to see a lot of folks who have time to sit around and think about these things.
Yeah, like
Get paid to think about these things.
like there are plenty of people who wrote before Athanasius, but a lot of it was you got to stay true, man. You gotta keep going. Here's what's worth it. There were some people who wrote they were already either in exile or in places that were like more amenable to Christianity. But he was among the first people who could really just kind of sit around and think all day. Which this is part of why so when he went to the Council of Nicaea, which maybe we should talk some about that because that does show up here. So the Council of Nicaea, we say the Nicene Creed every Sunday, right? That's kind of as Episcopalians and Anglicans, we have a pretty wide tent, right? That's one of our big things is there's a wide range of belief within our
Via media.
yeah. So we have a pretty wide range in the middle way. It's a big way, but we plant our flag in the Nicene Creed. That's where we say like you can believe a whole lot of whatever you want, but this is what we as a church believe, right? And one of the reasons we say, let us confess our faith and we believe in God the Father. There's this sense of we believing that. But this was kind of the first time that a creed was officially set forth. Saint Athanasius actually has his own. It's much longer. It's called the Athanasian Creed that he never wrote, but people after him kind of patterned after his thought, which is quite good. But the Nicene Creed goes into sort of this. It is debating so many heresies of the time or other thoughts that of the time. This is where, as famously Saint Nicholas, right, punched a heretic at Nicaea. So next week when we have our visit from the Bishop of Myra, right, he is the guy who famously slapped a heretic uh, at um, at the Council of Nicaea. Yeah, I can't wait.
Such a nicer image of him putting coins in young women's stockings on the clothesline so that they have bridal dowries. That's just a much gentler image of him,
Than a defender of orthodoxy. Yeah.
Interesting thing, because we talk about it like with Paul's letters, like Paul's kind of not coming up with a lot of his stuff out of thin air.
Yeah.
Like he's writing about issues. People are having trouble with whatever, and so he writes about the importance of Christian community. He's not just like making it up out of whole cloth. He's responding to a thing. Same here.
Yeah.
They're not just like developing theology for theology's sake.
Yeah.
There were lots of theologies that were developing, and they were almost like polling, saying, "You're good, Susan. You're a little radical, and so we're actually not going to buy what you're selling.
Yeah.
But you're good,
Yeah.
and so
yeah." And honestly, one of the things, so this feels like, and the way that we think about books now, right, is Athanasius had an idea, and so he wrote it down. No, that is not how this worked. That is not how hardly anything in the first couple centuries worked. Everything was sort of like, oh, here's a problem, let's get to it. So this is, okay. One of the things that's interesting about this, or something we have to understand before we start reading this is part 2 of a book that is honestly much more difficult to read. It's called Against the Gentiles, or Contra Gentile, I don't remember. But it is, so On the Incarnation is a part 2, and we'll see that because at the very first line in this book that he wrote is, "In what preceded, we have sufficiently treated a few points from many regarding the error of the Gentiles concerning idols and their superstition, how their invention from the beginning, and that out of wickedness human beings devised for themselves the worship of idols," which is a strong start. He's coming out swinging, right? But we have to understand that what had gone before was like a book-length treatise against what was happening in the world, especially in his kind of diocese of Alexandria. So he was the Bishop of Alexandria in Egypt. And so he was writing originally, this first part of the book was called Against Gentiles, where he was talking about the image of God, creation's relationship with God, the fall, and how the fall produced idol worship. And idol worship in sort of a different way that we understand it today. It wasn't it wasn't necessarily the golden calf. It wasn't necessarily cast down your idols. In some ways it was, but it was how do we with our bodies, how do we in a physical sense end up worshiping things that are not the living God? That's sort of what he was, what actions do we physically take that are worship of something that is not the living God? And so he has this fascinating kind of underpinning in the first part of it that is, what does worship look like? And how do we understand it in and of ourselves? What is it? What are actions that we take that are actually worship, or our worship of a false god, whether they claim to be a false god or not? Whether we worship them as such, how we treat them determines whether or not we see them as a false god, if that makes sense. So that's kind of the first part of Against the Gentiles. He also talks about this. Hang on, I have notes, I promise. He talks about this is going to be one of the things that we see throughout the entirety of this book, but he starts out all of Christian theology not with kind of this meta narrative back to creation, back to the fall, back to why God had to come. He'll talk about creation, he'll talk about the fall, he'll talk about all this stuff, but he's pretty uninterested in starting there. Those are only examples of what he's talking about. And so he starts with Jesus Christ is the one who ascended the cross. That is, if there's one thing you remember about what Athanasius says, it's that Jesus Christ is the one who ascended the cross. He will say that that's kind of his beginning point, that's his end point, that is his marker of what does Christian doctrine look like. If we're going to know who Jesus Christ is, he's the one who went up on the cross. And so he starts there as his kind of point of reference for, so what does that mean about God? Is Jesus Christ God? Is God the one who went up on the cross? What does that mean for us who worship the God who went up on the cross? What does it mean for us as we kind of moving forward? If God is the one who became incarnate in flesh, why did he get up on the cross? And so that'll be kind of what we talk about through all of this and what he kind of talks about through all of this. But that's if we go through with the memory of Christ is the one who ascended the cross, this will make a whole lot more sense, I promise. You got anything, boss?
Not on that, no.
Question.
Mm-hmm.
Greek Orthodoxy, and Greek thought tends to emphasize the incarnation more than Western.
Yes.
Western tends to emphasize the crucifixion and the resurrection more.
Yep.
With Greek Orthodoxy thinking, well, if it isn't God who's incarnated, does the other matter?
Right.
How much of what you just said in that sentence is influenced by your being Western?
Oh, I don't know if I can divorce myself from being
Okay.
influenced by the Western
'Cause,
theology.
you leaned one way and then you had a bias in what you said, and I was just
Absolutely.
wondering.
Oh, for sure, for
um,
sure. Yeah.
It's why I asked the question. And I think that we as individuals also have bias. I don't think one's right or wrong.
Mhm.
And I think it's holding those two ideas together and balancing them and understanding that the the Christmas wreath becomes the funeral wreath. That juxtaposition of those two seasons that sums up the Christian faith. I think that you cannot have one without the other.
I think that's his point too, is what
That,
like his incarnational theology begins at the cross.
Yeah, but which one, well, or that the cross begins at the crib.
Well,
You know,
arguably.
which moment is it that God stepped into human history?
Mm,
And which one, it's a chicken and the egg argument.
sure.
I'm not suggesting we spend, but to state that which one speaks to us as an individual is very revealing of where we are as individuals in our relationship with God at this moment.
Sure.
And I think that that's an important part of our looking inward at ourselves in this Christmas journey.
Sure. Absolutely. I think so too. Yeah, I mean, you made a good point. So Athanasius he is canonized in every Christian tradition, Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican, all of us. And you can see there's so much in here. There's a point in here where he says God became man so that man could become gods, right? And it's this fascinating thing because when I first read it, I was like, what? I don't care for that. And so there's this idea in Greek Orthodox and kind of Eastern theology of what's called theosis, right? In this, or deification, which is this idea that our journey in this life is to come back to God, not just to be next to God, but to become God, right? A part of God. And so this is Eastern Christianity, Eastern spirituality. This is this like one with nirvana in some ways, right? They're not the same, but they're comparable. And this is that deification and theosis. And so we'll see some things in here that are maybe challenging in some ways, because when we talk about the goal of the Christian life, very rarely in Protestantism or even Catholicism do we much talk about becoming one with God or unity with God. And in fact, there's a whole thing that we can kind of get into at a certain point with this about the goal of the Christian life. Yes, generally. You seem to want to say something.
In iconography, Iconography, I do iconography.
Mm-hmm.
In iconography, which is a part of the sacrament in Orthodoxy,
Mm-hmm.
when you write,
Mm.
it's a sacramental practice. It's the theology is sacramental,
Mm-hmm.
and sacrament is a verb.
Okay.
And so that whole concept there is about acting in that.
Mm.
It's about that process of acting out the mystery.
Mm.
It's not about a becoming so much as to act in unity with.
No, that's an interesting point.
And so, yes, we do talk about that in Catholic theology. We just use a little bit different language.
Okay.
The concept is there.
Yeah.
We just express it differently.
Yeah.
We talk about it much more in sacramental theology in the Roman Church than we do in that language that the Greeks use.
Mm-hmm.
So if you enter into the mysterium, and the Romans will talk about prime sacrament, which is Christ incarnate.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll talk about that. So it is sacrament as a verb. And so when we enter into that action of becoming one with the sacrament and to act in that, in that relationship with God, then we are entering that state of theology.
Cool.
And so, yes, we do talk about it. We just use a very different set of language.
But even that, right? Protestants would.
Oh, Protestants would have a fit.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
we're Protestant, right? And
Mhm.
so
We are, but we aren't.
We are. No. we
Oh,
are.
disagree. We are.
Well, I'm an Anglo-Catholic. I don't know about the rest of you. I'm high church, very, very high church over here.
But, you know, the super Protestants down the street who are having the big party right now,
Mhm.
they would lose their mind.
Oh,
as
I know
part of
they
this
would.
Conversation, but they would talk about a goal of life to being sanctified.
Yeah, or that their identity is in Christ.
Yeah.
It's
so
similar
what's the
language.
difference, right?
Yeah.
Like, are they pushing against some popish or cultish
Mm-hmm.
idea and just using different language? Or, because what is the difference between theosis, rejoining the stuff from which we came,
Mhm.
right?
Or sanctification or
we are
identity
made
in
God's
Christ.
image.
Yeah.
What does that mean? They would
Yeah.
have no problem saying that.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean?
Yeah.
To be consumed into the Godhead
Mm-hmm.
through sanctification, through whatever.
Yeah.
Versus the language, yeah, because that God became man so that man could become God,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Everyone reads that in seminary, and then fights break out.
Yes. That's like week 2.
Yeah, I was gonna say the idea we all talk about, we get very hissy about each other's language.
Sure.
And I want to say that we all express very similar ideas, and
Mhm.
I want to say that we do talk about those things. We
Yes.
call them slightly different things, and we use slightly different language, and
Mhm.
let's honor some of that different language in doing that. And yes, I'm very Anglo-Catholic, and
I'm Protestant,
Yeah,
but I believe
yeah.
wholeheartedly in theosis.
yeah.
Yes. Oh,
Like,
100%.
I
Yeah.
was the most easternmost guy sitting there because like I buy into this.
Oh yeah. I mean, this is the Rowan Williams, our old, now 2 removed, Archbishop of Canterbury. He was, before he became an Anglican priest in Wales, he was so confused because he was like, I want to be Orthodox because I love their liturgy, I love their theology, I love all these things, and my tradition is this, and I've been here. And he went to a spiritual director and was like, then just be an Orthodox Anglican, man, it's fine. And so it's interesting to read some of what he wrote, because he is a full Protestant, he is a high church Anglican, and he's deeply Orthodox in his theology, right? And so there's this huge breadth to it, because like when I first read it, I was deeply against it. I remember talking to our theology professor, like, so this is bad, and she was like, interesting take. And now I am deeply on board. Yeah, I want to see if anyone on Zoom has any questions or any thoughts.
If there's chat, they're all nodding.
Not Kathy. She's
Hi,
shaking her
Bailey.
head.
No questions in the chat. Y'all good?
Nothing to say, nothing to share.
I have
All right,
a
what-
question. I do
Yes.
have a question.
What is a copt, C-O-P-T? Because that is
Copt, like a
referenced.
Coptic?
Is that in the book?
It's in the
Yes.
book.
Egyptian Christian.
Yeah, Egyptian
Okay.
Christian.
Okay.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I love I love the easy ones.
They also have their own metro and their,
Mhm.
who's their own pope and their own
Yeah.
structure.
Just wait until we get to the end of the book and we start talking about it against the Jews.
Yeah.
We'll have lots of questions.
You can take that one if you want, boss.
No, that's.
Oh,
you've got
is that for me?
Yeah.
You're so sweet. You're so sweet. Do you guys have any questions or anything? Any thoughts? Okay.
Still absorbing.
So y'all too, to some extent, you come from evangelical background,
Yeah.
right? And so
Heck
you come liberty trained,
Jealous?
yeah. I mean, and you read this book.
Yeah.
Right? Do you remember, you talked about how you went and talked to Sandra?
Yeah, I did.
What was that like for you to wrestle with?
So, I mean, I was already at the point where I was like, okay, the fundamentalist evangelical, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera thing doesn't work for me anymore, right? And so there's got to be more to this. So I joined the Episcopal Church, yada, yada, yada. And then I ended up going to seminary and was like, oh, now we're talking about it? I don't know about all this. But kind of having this understanding that, one, it is a much bigger tent, and there's some really solid footing. Because that was one of the things that there are places to plant a flag. There are places because when I first joined the Episcopal Church, I loved like the kind of, the church that I went to especially, it was great. I loved it. But it was very, well, what you want, man, that's all good. And I needed that for a time. And I love that we still offer that in some ways. But I found myself needing more and more, somewhere solid to kind of step and somewhere to put my foot down, right? And to understand that there are lots of places to put your foot down. But you don't have to swim the whole time. There's not just always this free-floating thing. And to kind of get to the point with this, which helped spawn the Orthodox Church, fed the Catholic Church. We use so much of it. You can look in our prayer book. We have the Athanasian Creed, and we use so much of his in our prayers and stuff. You can see his influence, and especially some of his Psalm stuff. What Marcellinus, I think, was the letter that he wrote about this devotional thing on the Psalms. But to kind of understand that it is not. I went from one fundamentalism, which is here's the only way to believe, kind of swinging all the way to the other end, which was you can believe whatever you want. And now it's like I want to come back to the middle somewhere where it's like there are lots of things to believe that are all going to be not wrong. And so kind of coming down on, this was a beginning of that for me, is this understanding of like there's some hard places to land and some not even hard, but solid places that we can land was really quite feeding for me. I mean, Lewis talks about it in the preface to this when he says, he talks about how for some people, reading a devotional book can be really great. Like reading a book of devotions or reading like a Christian living kind of book can be really feeding for their souls. And then for some people, reading a thick dogmatic text can actually be a work of genuine devotion for them. He says working through it with a pipe in your mouth and a pen in your hand can be so like much more feeding for the soul than reading through beautiful poetry and prayers. And I found that to be true for me because it meant, I don't know if it meant that I worked for it. I don't know if it meant that it was difficult, but that it was something that I was somewhere I was able to land in a solid way. Yeah. Good question, boss. Yeah. I think we're going to get into, we can talk about kind of structure for the next couple weeks. So we're going to jump straight in. We've talked, you're welcome to read if you have this copy or whatever copy you have, you're welcome to read an introduction or about it as much as you want. Next week, I think that he breaks this down into 57, 58 chapters, and the chapters are maybe a page long, right? And so we're going to break it down. So are we doing anything the 22nd or is this a 3-week thing?
3 weeks.
Okay, so we're going to break this down. So next week, we're going to get through chapter 32. So we're going to read prologue chapters 1 through 32, and then I will get, I think Alan's teaching on that. And so I guess it is me teaching 33 through 57, refutation of the Jews, refutation of the Gentiles, and the conclusion. So we're breaking it down. Do you have these chapter numbers in yours?
I have, mine are in parts. It's,
Okay,
it's
interesting.
prologue.
Oh, so the death of Christ, the resurrection. Yeah, so you will read up through 5.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, where's 5 in this one?
So that's going to be resurrection of the body. So to
Okay.
chapter 32.
Okay.
Yeah, page 70 for
Okay,
us
so
with
that's-
this one. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's how that's going to work. And we'll, I think as far as expectation for this is just to have read it. You do not need to have understood it. We're going to talk through it, I promise, because this is dense. Like it really is. I was rereading it a couple weeks ago in preparation for this, and I was like, oh, I forgot that like this was me sitting on the floor of my bathroom in seminary at like 2 a.m. being like, I have to get this by 9 a.m. and I don't get it. But we'll continue to talk about it. I'm trying to think of anything else you need to know before kind of
It'd be
starting.
really helpful if you'd done a whole list of, I'm sitting here writing all the scriptures. It really would have been helpful if you'd done a full exegesis.
Yes, yeah, if we can,
To get this, what did?
oh,
he
when,
would-
well, that was my feeling. And the reality is like I felt like if I'm going to be in seminary, I need to be smart enough to be in seminary. That was my feeling at the time. Get this was I want to understand because even in the English, the language is you feel like you're like, what on earth did I just read? Like I want to understand this and going slowly over and over the same thing and not quite getting what he's saying and then feeling like you've got it and then he refutes it the next sentence and you're like, okay, but what do you mean? And so we'll talk about some of those confusing things because I remember I still have the we got it offline and so it was this I had this thick stack of printed paper that was like copied it over and over and over again. And I still have big red question marks all over. I should have brought that, but I still have I still have all that. And so there was plenty of stuff that is just confusing, but it's still, it makes sense when we talk through it. And that was kind of this as well. And so like he uses simple Greek that we actually make into complex English in some ways. It's like how First John is incredibly simple English or simple Greek. Like one of the first things you do when you are learning Greek is you translate First John. Because it's just God is love, love is God, love is of God, love is with God, you are of God, all of these things that are just slightly variant. But then when we end up translating it into English, it becomes this kind of, it's easy to read, difficult to understand. And that's going to be this as well. So this is, it's slow going, but you don't have to have read all of it. You can have read some of it, and we'll just talk through what we've read through.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing at you, I'm a practicing mystic.
Oh, excellent.
And part of what mystics do is they create a pattern of life that gives them visions. And everybody can have visions. You just need to know how to provoke them. And one of the things you do to provoke them is study and pick questions and to wrestle and to pray and to do that. And when you get these visions, after hours and hours and hours of wrestling with these things that you just do not understand, and you get these incredible moments of deep, saturating peace and feeling like you've been in the presence of one of the persons of Trinity, and these moments of incredible, crystal clear understanding of God, and then you try to put that experience into language, and it freaking vanishes.
Yes. Yep.
And you say
Maybe
you're
yes,
gonna,
it should.
and then you say we're going to talk it over, and it gets no.
Well, we can.
This is so beyond the capacity to put it into language.
I would think so.
That's why when we say we all have a different gift, like, no, we shouldn't be fighting over that. It is so beyond the capacity of language. That's why when, one of the things in my journey I did was I went back to the original scriptures and I said, how do all these theologians and idiots know what they're talking about? I'm sorry, I had John Cobb for confirmation. I don't know if you know who John
I
Cobb
do
is.
not.
Christian Natural Theology.
Oh,
Practical
sure,
Theology.
sure,
I had
sure,
John
sure.
Cobb at 13
Excellent.
for confirmation.
Woof.
Bad influence. They should never have let John Cobb loose with 12-year-olds. And I went, how do all these idiots know what they're talking about? These seminary professors who I have now had for confirmation class. How do these idiots actually know what they're doing? So I went back and started doing 14-point exegesis in scripture. And I discovered that the most magnificent, beautiful, and complete theology is actually in the first century. That
Yeah.
we have been diluting it
Mhm.
because we've been trying to put it in words.
Mm.
That Christianity sprung fully formed.
Yeah, it was ready to go.
In its most complete
Mm.
in the beginning.
Mm.
It has not been added to, it's been diluted.
Mm.
And when you go back and you start going, where do we change things? Where did we add things? Where did we get screwed up? And you go back to this incredibly full faith as handed down by Christ.
Mm.
We find this very full, rich faith that he is closer than we are.
Oh, yeah.
So we find a very full faith in him that we don't find in some of the more modern writings because he's closer.
Mm.
And you find this very full faith back there. And you find it in John, you find it in Paul, you find it in all these layers. And every one of these writers has their own code words you have to decipher. And you have to wrestle. What is he talking about when he's talking about this code? And what other language parts are we trying to use to figure out what his code is?
Mm-hmm.
And what are they talking about in relationship with this code and breaking down these codes? Because this is so beyond what language is able to express that we have to go behind the words.
Or we have to just accept.
It depends on how much you want to accept and how much you want to understand. And that's different for each of us.
Mm.
And that's, some of this we can blame on the West, and I blame everything on the Enlightenment. We think we can figure everything. And so we take the incarnation, for example. It becomes a case of how can a virgin get pregnant? What are shepherds doing in the field in the middle of December? It becomes all these technical questions that we like.
Yeah, for me, that just doesn't matter.
Right? And I think for the people who wrote down.
Paul calls that a gift.
Right? No, I think for the people who were writing this down, I don't think they would have conceived that 2,000 years later, people would be like,
Wrestling with all of this.
like
Yeah.
nonsense stuff.
Yeah, and I
assumed that he was born in December and that wasn't a later edition.
I don't assume.
But that's what I'm saying. And everybody's point of where they accept is different, and I'm fine with that.
No, I think so.
It's-
Depending on your individual experiences.
Yeah. I mean, it goes like, some of this, the Eastern, we're talking about Greek theology, whatever, apophatic theology,
yeah.
right? Like Greek tend to focus more on, we know things that are not of God.
Yeah.
Like we can kick those out.
Yeah.
The other stuff, yeah, we can't definitively say almost anything about God other than like God is love.
Yeah.
We can say a lot of things aren't of God.
Yeah.
But it's kind of knowing what something is by knowing what
Yeah.
something is not.
Affirmation through negation.
Right.
Yeah.
But we try to figure out what it is.
Yeah.
And we get a little too wrapped around the axle doing that.
And there's so much in here where he will make fascinating claims about what God is not. And you have to sit with that almost longer than when he makes claims about what God is or how God works or functions or does or the nature of God. So,
Yeah, we do an awful lot of things in the church. Clarence Darrell, who was not a great theologian, he was definitely an atheist, most of him, or at least an agnostic. When they asked him, and I don't know if it's a true quote, it may have been apocryphal. Somebody asked him if he believed in God after the Scopes trial, and his response was, I believe God created man, and man in his infinite wisdom returned the favor. My definition of bad theology is when we try to recreate God. And I always hold that up and say, is this a doctrine where we are recreating God? And a lot of what we argue about in theology is when we try to recreate God.
Fascinating.
And I think I like the mystics because most of us don't do that. We go, yeah, that's.
Yeah.
A little less dogmaticness and a little more.
If we don't have any other questions, I think we can break for.
Yeah, and so I'd say,
Um,
we're gonna talk about any questions there on the Zoom.
Yeah.
We're gonna come with whatever questions you have, and if you've been part of the Tuesday night book group, I know some of y'all on the call are. Even if you haven't had a chance to read it, or if you read it and it completely goes over your head, still show up.
Yeah.
With whatever questions you have, or just, if we just wanna, we could spend a whole class just talking about what incarnation means, like,
Yeah.
and not even get into this, like.
Yes.
This is, yes, we're gonna wrestle with the meat of this book.
Yes.
But this is also just an off point to what we hope is a larger conversation.
Yes. And about the season of Advent and about what it means and everything.
I'm very interested in hearing what we have to say, what this group and what this book has to say about incarnation.
Mhm.
You know, my understanding and my acceptance and my belief is mine. And I feel like it's fairly compatible with most people's understanding and belief, but I think it's going to be very interesting for me because I don't do a lot of studying.
Yeah.
So it's going to be very interesting for me to learn what this person's
Yeah.
understanding
Yeah.
was and what has been given to us to wrestle with now.
Mhm.
So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
That's great. All right.
Is there anything else y'all hope to get out of these next 2 weeks?
Yeah.
If we get to the end of the 15th and we haven't done this, y'all are all gonna be ticked off at Gavin, not me. Anything?
I'm teaching that day.
No, we're
Okay,
good?
great. No expectations of Gavin. Excellent. All right.
This
all
is
right.
new territory for me, so I don't know what to expect.
So
Yeah.
again, we're just reading up through, I mean, we'll send that an email, but just up through chapter 32 or heading 32. Yep. And then, or the resurrection of the body. All right. Thanks, y'all.
Very good. Thank
Thank
y'all.
you.
Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thank y'all.
Susan, sometimes people have a good day.